Doctor González, queremos empezar la entrevista
Okay.
hoy en la tarde con su nombre. If you would tell us name at birth, name of your parents, where your parents were from, when you were born, where you were born. And from that biographical information, we will then move eventually into some stories of your childhood.
Okay.
We will then move into some very specific stories around your practice as a professional educator who worried a lot and did a lot of work with bilingual education programs. We're going to start, though, by saying that today is the 14th day of October of 2013. My name is Francisco Guajardo. We are in the College of Education at UT Pan American in the Center for Bilingual Studies. And with me is a colleague of mine who will help me facilitate this oral history. And so I'm going to give her a chance to introduce herself, and then we're going to move into you and your stories.
I'm Joy Izquierdo, and I am from Edcouch, Elsa. My dad is from Edcouch, and my mom is originally from Monte Alto. I am faculty here in the College of Education at UTPA. I am bilingual faculty with the bilingual program, and currently the coordinator of the graduate program and Master's in Bilingual Ed, and one of the associate directors for the Center for Bilingual Studies. It's a privilege to be here.
So it is quite appropriate also, not only a privilege, but it is quite appropriate that a bilingual education professor in the Center for Bilingual Studies be interviewing one of the pioneers in bilingual education in this institution, and probably in the state as well. We're going to find out what that means, your life story, and and see what kind of also specific stories you can share with us, from which we can glean some lessons that we and posterity can learn. So if we can start, Dr. Gonzalez, with the very biographical name, date of birth, your parents, etc.
I was born with the name of Jorge Adalberto Gonzalez. But very quickly in my educational life, my principal could not pronounce the word Jorge. It was too difficult for him. So he changed my name to George, and I've been George since then, in the 4th grade, I think. But so he baptized me, George.
But
And
in your birth
that's it.
certificate, what does your birth certificate say?
The church birth certificate says Jorge, the church. The city, I think, says George. That's a good question.
Your parents.
My father's name was Lázaro Gonzalez. My mother was Elvira Ochoa from the Peñitas area. She was born in Abram, and it was also called El Ojo de Agua. So when I went to school, and we were not allowed to speak Spanish, it was forbidden. The teacher asked me, "Where was your mother born?" And I said, "She was born in the eye of water." She couldn't find it on the map. But it was Ojo de Agua, and I figured I better say eye of water, because I could be punished. My father was born in Cadereyta, Mexico, and came over when he was a young boy. Cadereyta is famous for its people who are supposed to be locals. So I was very embarrassed to tell a story about my father being from Cadereyta. So I always said to the teachers, he was from around Monterrey. And that's the best I could do. But later on I went to Cadereyta and saw the people of Cadereyta, and they're great people, hardworking, proud people. So I now claim Cadereyta. Yeah. But
When were your parents born, and the occasion upon which they may have met, as far as you know?
early in the 1900s. I don't really know the exact dates, but 19 early.
Date of your birth?
June the 9th of 1934. in McAllen, Texas. That makes me 79 years old.
Where were you born in McAllen? You can keep it
Uh,
up. Where were you born in McAllen?
Julia Saunders was a midwife for most of the Hispanic community, if not all the Hispanic community. And she had like a little clinic, tiny clinic. And I was born there. La Clínica de Julia Saunders.
Julia Saunders era mujer mexicana o americana?
Not at all. She was Anglo. But she loved Hispanics. She went to work in that area.
El papá de usted y la mamá de usted, ¿a qué se dedicaban?
Vamos a hablar español ahora.
Como quiera hablar.
My father was a great butcher. He bought cows and he butchered them, and he made menudo. He made all kinds of delicacies, Mexican delicacies, chorizo, and so that's what he mostly did. He'd go out and find some cows wherever in the countryside, buy them, and then produce meat.
And your mother?
My mother had a little store, tiny little store on 17th Street in McAllen, which is the heart of Mexican town in McAllen. And that's where I was born. The neighborhood was called La Paloma. I don't know if you've heard of La Paloma. And that's, in the Roosevelt School was just a few blocks away, and that's where I went to school. But my mother had a little store. She saved pennies and nickels until she bought a lot closer to the business side of 17th Street. Is now, and she built the building, and we had a restaurant, we had a tortilla factory, we had a grocery store, a meat market, and it's now called El Rex.
Where your mother had
She built the building.
El Cine?
No, it says El Rey. El Rey is a theater. El Rex is a
Like a bakery?
bakery and restaurant. She built it. She hired the plumbers, the carpenters, the bricklayers.
Before you were born or after you?
No, after I was born. Yeah.
So you remember?
Oh, distinctly. Yeah. You know, when we sold it, because the economy wasn't very good, I was about 15 or 16 years old. Yeah. But she had no education. She never went to school, nor did my father. Their parents figured that they didn't need to go to school. My grandmother on my mother's side insisted women should stay at home and learn to cook and learn to take care of the house. So my mother,
How many children did your mother have?
5. I am number 2 among 5.
Who are the others?
4 of them have not done very well. One graduated from high school and college and has a good job in Las Vegas, but the rest did not do well at all.
Well, what kind of life did they have?
Not very pleasant.
How did you manage to have a different kind of life?
My mother, well, I think three features of my life, 3 factors in my life helped me to become more educated than my brothers, more successful than my brothers, although they're just as smart as can be. My mother figured that I was the smart one and I should do well in school. And she pushed this, and she told everybody about it. And whenever my report card would come home, she would take it around the entire neighborhood, showing my report card. And so she figured that I needed to go to school and do well in school. This was not true for my brothers. You also need a great teacher who inspires you. And that was Mrs. Robinson in high school. She's a great teacher, and I admired her. And whenever she'd praise me, that was the highlight of my life.
Before Mrs. Robbins, can you share a little bit with us about your early childhood experiences? Where did you go to elementary school? What was the experience there? What were the teachers like? What about the other children? How did you get along?
It was a barrio school designated for Hispanics, Latinos, because it was the south side of McAllen. So we were all expected to go to that school. I didn't speak English at all, not a single word of English, because my parents only spoke Spanish. We studied Dick and Jane, and Spot and Puff. Spot, Puff, Dick, Jane, father, mother. Those were the characters that introduced me to the English language. And there were 17 words in the first pre-primer. I still have a copy of it. And those 17 words were oh, look, see, puff, spot. And so we learned those words, those 17 words, quite well. And we were asked to go out to the playground and speak English. And if we didn't speak English, we would be punished, we'd be spanked. I was spanked once for speaking Spanish, so I gave it up completely. So I had 17 words with which to work. And so my conversations out there in the playground were, oh, see Spot go, funny, funny Spot. Can Spot jump? Yes, Spot can jump. Those are the only words I knew, and those were the only conversations I could have. My friends told me it was very boring, but what do you do with 17 words? But the philosophy of the teachers to make us speak a language when we had the barest of vocabulary seemed unrealistic. But I did very well. I was double promoted, triple promoted.
You did not go to the first grade twice.
No. Many of my friends did. They went to low first and then high first. Then they graduated to low second and then they went to high second. I jumped from first to third.
Why?
I don't know. They marched us in a line to the other school. And I was advanced. So I graduated from high school when I was 16. I came to Pan American immediately. I graduated from Pan American at the age of 19. I graduated first in my class and started teaching.
What was the name of your elementary school, the first one?
Roosevelt. And it's still there. It's an old building on 17th Street, Roosevelt. But we call it La Escuela Blanca because it was white. We always call our schools by the color of the school, traditionally, in the barrio. Yeah, and then I went to Sam Houston School, which is closed now. And then I went to McAllen High School. It's interesting because I went to those schools and then I taught in those schools. I taught in Sam Houston School, I taught in McAllen High School, and then I came to Pan American. Later, I taught here. So it's very interesting.
A couple months ago, we interviewed Ramon Villescas.
Oh, yes, he's great.
He must have grown up somewhere around your neighborhood.
He's from far.
Right, but when he was a child, he grew up in McAllen.
Is that right? Okay.
And he went to La Escuela Blanca.
Escuela Blanca.
But he said that he went to La Escuela Blanca a little later on. First, he went to a school que la Sociedad Guadalupana había establecido,
Yeah.
con un profesor que se llamaba Yáñez.
Yáñez.
Yáñez. Does that ring a bell?
Oh, yes.
Did you know
distinctly.
him?
No, but I knew of the school. I knew of the school.
You did not go to that school.
No, I had a private tutor. My mother hired a private tutor to teach me after school. After school.
To teach you English?
Spanish. She believed very strongly that I needed to learn to read Spanish. So el professor Herrera, who lived on 17th Street, who was considered our local intellectual, because he worked on our income tax reports, he was my tutor. And he taught me how to read in Spanish.
Do you,
She paid him 50 cents an hour.
do you have any idea how long El Profesor Herrera tutored you? Was this 3 or 4 weeks, 4 or 5 months, a year or two? How old were you?
I can't remember. Must have been like 7 or 8, maybe. And it must have been maybe a year. It didn't go on forever. Yeah.
But you remember it well.
He was very highly respected. He wore a tie. The only person in the neighborhood who wore a tie.
How formative was the experience that you had with El Profesor Herrera?
It was crucial for me because I learned to read this other language that I was speaking at home. And, it was very relational. Yeah. But I principally worked on learning English and doing well in school. That was my mission.
While you spoke of 17 words in English,
The first pre-primer,
the first,
little book.
the little, okay. When El Profesor Herrera taught you, did he teach you through books?
Used books from Mexico, I think. Yeah, because it's simple phrases. Yeah.
But many more than 17 words.
Oh, yeah. It is mostly mi mamá me ama, amo a mi mamá me mima, Emma ama a mamá, memo mi mami, a mí. Very syllabic, and very much fun, I thought,
Very,
because I love school. During the summers when school was closed, I would go to school, even though there's nobody there, and I'd peer through the window, and I'd look inside the classrooms, and I'd imagine myself walking along in the classroom.
Roosevelt,
Roosevelt. Yeah.
who do you remember as teachers at Roosevelt?
I don't remember many. Ms. Myers was my first grade teacher, Ms. Myers, and she was very kind, although she didn't let us speak Spanish, but she was very kind, and we looked up to her. And Miss Thickman was the principal. Now there's a Thickman Elementary School in McAllen, and she was our principal. And during the war, she fed us milk and chocolate milk and apples. And it was nice.
Mr. Villescas told a story of Mrs. Thigpen.
She spanked me for speaking Spanish
Once? Twice?
one time. And then I never said another Spanish word.
Do you remember the occasion?
Oh, yes, distinctly.
How so? Tell us about it.
Well, I was taken to the office. This was the biggest fear, always. You're going to have to go to the principal's office. And I was told I had to stop speaking Spanish, and I was spanked.
But was she the one who heard you, or was it another
No,
teacher who heard
no, the children. They had children who would report you.
you? Really?
Yeah, kind of like the Gestapo. And they would gather names of kids who had spoken Spanish, and they'd bring these names to the teacher. But we would not dare speak Spanish in front of the teacher. Yeah, but we grew up with the feeling that Spanish must be very bad because we got spanked for it. And if it was as bad, like sinning, well, then my mother, that's all she spoke. So she must be a very bad woman. So those are the effects of not allowing children to speak their language.
It was like sinning, he thought.
Yeah, it must be very bad because you're taken to the office of the principal and you're spanked for it. It has to be very bad.
How do you see that impacting your own psyche, your own sense of self, your own intellect?
I think we had a massive inferiority complex in the barrio. I think because we're always put down for our language. We had a Mexican restaurant, but I didn't want to let the kids know at school that we had a Mexican restaurant because Dick and Jane didn't have a Mexican restaurant. And so the kids would make fun of me and they tell the teacher, Miss, he sells tamales, he sells tacos. And of course I said, no, we don't. Because he was supposed to be embarrassing. So, you know, you developed a self-concept that's not quite healthy. But I knew that I could make good grades. And I knew that I was making better grades than a lot of people who didn't speak Spanish, who only spoke English. And therefore, that gave me a sense of.
How old were you before you came to believe and were convinced that a taco, that a tamal was a culturally good thing?
I think when I started, this was much later, looking through magazines like Better Homes and Garden, and looking at recipes on how to make enchiladas and how to make tacos. So I figured, hey, it's valued by the larger society. But that's what it takes, you know.
But you were 45 already.
45 years old?
Yes.
No.
When you saw that magazine.
Well, no, I don't think so.
How old were you?
I don't remember, really I don't. But there was not a lot of positive reinforcement for our culture in the schools. English was the dominant language of the characters in our stories, the things that they did, the things that they enjoyed were not the things that we enjoyed. Their dog was part of the family. It was in their house with them, and their cat. Our dog was tied to a tree in the backyard. Very, very different. Their grandmother in the stories had a farm, and the characters would go visit the grandmother in the farm and play with the animals. Our grandmother lived right there with us in a little house in the back. So life was very different from the textbooks. And that was our life, the textbooks.
So you went to high school probably at the age of 13, 14.
13.
McAllen High School?
Guys.
What was that like?
It was very separate. Very separate. The Hispanics always waited for the bell to ring on the south side of the high school, and the Anglos spent their mornings before the bell in the north side. There was no mingling, no conversing. Even in the classrooms, we were separated.
Now, you were in high school in 1947, 1948, 1949, more or less.
Yes.
Was the word Hispanic a word used at the time?
No, we've gone through a series of evolutions where we were, as I remember, Mexican Americans. No, I'm sorry. Becca. We were Latin Americans. And whenever I remember I got a ticket for speeding, and it said nationality, L.A. And I wondered what that meant. Then I figured out it's Latin American. So from Latin American, we became Mexican American. From Mexican American, we became, I guess, Hispanic. Now Latino is very popular now. But it's, most of those names were given to us by the much larger culture. They gave us those names. We became Latin American and then Mexican American.
And at the age of 79, you used the word Hispanic.
Most of the time, 'cause that's what I've grown used to. It's habit. But I realize that in the media, Latino is a is a popular word, very popular.
So the Mexican American kids waited after school in one part of the
Before school started.
before school started, like mingling.
Yeah, in the south side of the high school building, and the Anglo students were in the north side with the grass, beautiful grass. Yeah.
And on occasion, some would cross.
Yes.
Any kind of, besides this separation practice, any kind of strife?
Not that I could tell. No.
They just had their places.
They knew their place, they had their place, and we were not part of it.
How was your experience in high school?
It was good because I did well. My teachers liked me. I was named the school's good fellow. So I was in the annual. My picture came on the annual as a good fellow. And only the kids who did well were good fellows. I was inducted in the National Honor Society. There were three Hispanics in the National Honor Society. It was Dr. Ramiro Darro, who later went to Rio Grande City to be a doctor, medical doctor, Irene Gonzalez, and I. So it was something to be proud of. Because my parents didn't understand any of that.
Did you, while you were in high school, work at the restaurant?
Yes. I was a cashier, which I hated.
You hated it. Was your work at the restaurant your private life?
In what sense?
Was it something that you kept to yourself?
Oh, absolutely. And when Coach Moser, I think, the football coach, came in to buy some tortillas, I was horrified. Yeah, it was a point of embarrassment, and I don't understand why now. But the culture does something to you. Society does something to you.
When you reflected years later on that experience of working at the family restaurant, where you were clearly contributing to the family economy and well-being, did you at some point, and I wonder when it was, if it did happen, and I'm assuming that it did, you reflected on it as a good and positive thing, that you were working toward the family economy?
Yes.
Yeah.
I felt gratified that my mother benefited from my being there, because I was trusted and I could give change accurately. So
Did Coach Moser ever say anything?
no, I don't think he recognized me.
But you knew who he was.
Oh, absolutely. He was a famous football coach. Yeah. I'm just mentioning these incidents because I'm pointing out that there was shame, but it was unearned. Unearned shame. Shame that we imposed upon ourselves. But as you grow older and wiser and you accomplish certain things, like I was a teacher upon graduation from Pan American in Hidalgo as a fourth grade teacher for 1 year. And then next year I was a principal.
You graduated from McAllen High School in 1951. 51. Did you immediately come to this university?
Oh yes, immediately. I didn't spend any time.
Who guided you here?
You know, that's interesting because my parents knew nothing about education. They couldn't help me at all. I didn't even know that there was a college 8 miles away from my hometown. But I had a friend, and that was the third part. You see, I mentioned having a mother that supports you to the hilt, having a teacher like Mrs. Robinson, but then you need a great friend whom you can model after. And I met Gus Guerra. He later became superintendent of Farsaw and Alamo, the first Hispanic superintendent in Farsaw and Alamo, and he was my best friend. and he was going to come to Pan American because his family knew about education. The father had been on the school board. So he said, "You mean you have all A's and you're not going?" So he convinced me, and I showed up, and my mother supported me financially, got me a car.
Do you remember how many kids you graduated with from McAllen High School?
No, but it wasn't very many. Maybe 80 or 90, maybe. Yeah.
And you were somewhere in the top.
You know, they never told us. We were never counseled properly by our counselors in high school. I took a test for abilities, native abilities, basic abilities. It's called the Cooter test. Probably doesn't exist anymore. And the teacher who gave me the test, she's a counselor, said I would be very good as a clerk because I had great clerical skills. That's what she figured that was my destiny, to be a clerk. So they didn't really advise us about colleges or about possibilities.
So you applied to this place.
Yes.
At the time it was called
Edinburgh Regional College, I think.
Edinburgh Regional College.
Yes.
And at the time it was already a 4-year school?
Yes. It was in the embryonic stage of becoming a 4-year school. In the first graduating class, of which I was not a part, they had to scrounge around and look for people who had enough hours so they could have a graduating class. So it was a very meager thing at that.
Previous to that, so you probably were maybe the second or third graduating class, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
Previous to that, students who came here could only get an associate's degree and then transfer to the University of Texas or Texas A&M. So when you came to college here, how did you get here every day?
Most of the time we hitchhiked. Yes, we'd stand on Highway 83, Business 83, and just hitchhiked. And we had books, so people figured they're students, and they'd give us a ride. That was much of the time. Then later, there was a friend in the neighborhood who worked in Edinburgh, so he picked me up every day and brought me to Pan American.
Who was he? Where did he work?
I think he was a blue-collar worker, a day laborer, but he had a car. I don't remember his name, unfortunately. There's a lot of things I don't remember.
But he was one of these guys who maybe worked at Rogers Produce or one of these places?
He had not graduated from high school, but he had a car, and he brought me.
And so he would drop you off wherever he worked, and you would then walk to Edinburgh Regional.
Yeah.
So if you, in your first year of college, came to this college, this university, or college at the time, say 150 times your freshman year, out of those 150, just a guess, how many of those 150 days would you have hitchhiked?
Maybe 1/3. Maybe. Because we hitchhiked a lot.
To and from.
To and from. Yeah.
¿Dónde estudiaba?
I had a nice room. My mother situated me really well because she wanted me to do well. And she bought me a typewriter when I was just a young kid in the 3rd or 4th grade. And she hired a man from South America to give me typing lessons. She bought me a bicycle. I was the only kid in the neighborhood that had a bicycle.
Did your mother ever tell you why she did that? Were you her chosen one?
I think so, in a sense. I think some Mexican parents, I don't want to generalize, label their children. She's the pretty one, kind of dumb, but she's pretty. Here's the intelligent one, not good looking, but intelligent. And my mother had a way of saying my brother Roy was the good looking one, that I was a smart one. And then there was the bad one. So,
What if you were good looking and smart?
oh, that would have been great. Roy was good looking. Roy was very good. He was nominated most handsome. Nominated. Yeah.
So you came to this school, which was not here at the time.
No,
Or what?
it was closer to the Edinburgh School District
It
offices.
was across the railroad tracks.
Yes.
You came here how many years?
3. 3.5, yeah. So I made it by age 19.
What did you study?
Education. And I wanted to have an elementary major, a secondary major, a Spanish major, and an English major. I was able to do all 4. Through careful planning of courses, I could assemble them together to create that kind of degree. So I've taught elementary, I taught secondary. I taught Spanish in McAllen High School. I was one of the Spanish teachers.
When you came to the college, do you remember your freshman courses, what they were?
Typical English, government, history, biology. Typing, no. I took typing in high school, and I was not very good.
What was the racial makeup of the faculty? What was the racial makeup of the student body when you came here?
I think, and those, one never notices. I think most of my professors here were Anglos. I don't remember a single Hispanic professor here. In elementary, I had Miss Juarez, Mr. Gutierrez. In secondary, I had Miss Garza, but there were very, very few. Yeah. Then when I applied in McAllen after graduating, really with high honors, I was not hired.
So you graduated with high honors from the college.
Yes, and I went to McAllen to apply for a job as a teacher, and I was not hired.
Was someone else hired?
I don't know whom they were hiring. I just went to apply. And there was a man on the school board who lived in the barrio. And I went to see him. And he said, I went to talk to him, and they will not hire you. So I went to Hidalgo. And I taught in Hidalgo. Mr. Baker was a great, great man. He helped me, the superintendent. And then the second year, Dr. Morgan was my professor here. And they asked him to recommend somebody to be principal of a school south of Donna. And he recommended me. And over the phone, they interviewed me and they hired me. So it was a school called Run, R-U-N-N, Run Elementary School.
You were the principal of Run Elementary in 1950.
55, 56, roughly.
You were a school teacher for how many years before Run?
1 year. But then in Run, I was also a teacher. I was a teaching principal. I had 4th grade, 5th grade, and 6th grade in one classroom. And then I was a principal. And all my teachers, well, we're only 5 teachers. They were all good friends of mine. We were buddies, and we'd share rides to Run. But I got the library accredited. The library had not been accredited. I got the library accredited. We wrote lesson plans for the first time. Nobody had written lesson plans before. I gave them the guidelines for lesson plans. I went to Moorfield and Air Base and bought a building, a huge building for $100, I think, from the federal government. And I had it transferred over by the Atkins brothers. And we had a cafeteria, we had meeting rooms, we had a stage with this big building that I that I bought.
How long were you at Run
2 years.
as a teacher and principal?
Yeah.
Where did you go after that?
McAllen. Finally, they hired me in McAllen
To do what?
to teach. I taught Thigpen Elementary School, 4th grade. I had 44 students. Then I went to Sam Houston, and Mr. Guerra hired me in Sam Houston. The principal hired me in Sam Houston School, and he said he was going to give me the brightest of the bright. So he gave me about 30 kids, selected very carefully as the brightest kids, and they were brilliant. And it was delightful to teach them. I had Rogelio Hinojosa, Roberto de la Garza. I had, I remember a lot of the names because they were great. And I was not married then, so I'd go to school on Saturdays to work on bulletin boards, and they'd all show up, and we'd have classes.
How long did you teach in McAllen?
1, 2, 3, 4. I went to high school after that, so I taught in McAllen High School a couple of years, maybe 6, maybe 7 years. Yeah,
Before you went to the high school? Or with the high school?
with the high school, including the high school.
What campus were you in when Ramiro Caso ran for the board and won?
You know, I should know that because he's my compadre. My daughter married his son, but I don't remember.
I want to say it was 55, 56 when he ran for the school board. And he ran because he was very upset with the segregationist practices of McAllen ISD.
Yes.
And he got the community to rally behind him, won, and then challenged Othel Brand, who was on the school board, to do something about integrating the schools. While he did that, you were a teacher in the school district.
Yes. Yes. I don't remember who the superintendent was, but there was one superintendent during those years who asked us to stay behind at the general convocation. He wanted his Mexican-American teachers to stay behind, and he let all the others go from the meeting, after the meeting. And then he was talking to us directly, and he said, I understand you people speak Spanish sometimes on campus. I want you to know it's forbidden. And if we hear you speak Spanish in the cafeteria, on the playground, anywhere, we will fire you, and you lose your teaching certificate. Mr. Hill, he was fired next year.
I wonder if it may have been because of the pressure of one Ramiro Caso.
Maybe. Maybe. But,
Because you know what? Dr. Caso told me that story.
he's a great man. But he's dead.
He told me that story.
Yeah.
He was on the board, and certain Mexicano teachers who were close to him went and told him. But was this written somewhere that it was illegal to do this, or was the superintendent just citing a cultural practice that became de jure in his mind?
I don't think it was written. I don't think so. I know that during the war, the teachers were not allowed to teach any other language except English, because people began to develop the spirit of English only, and the German communities around Ransfels had to quit teaching in German. So Texas has always been that kind of state.
So after McAllen ISD, as a teacher, and were you an administrator in McAllen?
No.
Okay.
I went too far to be an administrator. I went to Alamo.
When?
66, I think, 66. And I was a principal of 2 schools. I had Franklin Elementary School, and I had Fulton Elementary School. Fulton is now called it's got a name of a teacher, but he was Fulton then when I was principal, and I had an assistant principal.
How long were you in PSJ?
About 3 years. And again, there was a lot of discrimination. Kids were not allowed to speak Spanish. Teachers would send kids to my office. Now then I was a full-time principal because I had 2 schools. And they'd ask me to spank them for speaking Spanish. You know, Juanito spoke Spanish. He said 2 Spanish words, spank him. And I wouldn't do it. And they didn't like me.
What did you say to Juanito?
To go back to class. But I'd go into a classroom and I'd speak Spanish to the kids. You know, I'd say,
You were in violation.
I was in violation of some rule, I guess. And I'd say, esta tarde le dicen a sus padres que vengan a la junta de noche, a la noche. And the teachers were furious how dare I speak that horrible language to the kids. And they had been telling kids not to speak Spanish, and here the principal came in and spoke to him in Spanish,
Why were you doing it?
just to show him. Yeah, I mean, I was very flexible, and they did not like me at all. And when I left, I told them, if Jesus Christ was your principal, you'd crucify him. They didn't like me. But I was hired by the Regional Service Center to go to San Antonio, Region 1. I'm sorry, Region 20. This is Region 1. Region 20. And I was their bilingual director.
Right after.
This was 1960, 68. It was during Hemisphere, and there was a lot of emphasis on Hispanic culture, and the center decided to have a bilingual component, and I was the bilingual director of Region 20, the very first. And we had 18 counties to serve. It was my job to go out to the different counties and try to get the principal to begin a bilingual program. And I was not that successful, but I was successful in certain. In La Edgewood, you know La Edgewood?
This would have been when Pepe Cardenas was superintendent already, or right before?
No, Steinhauser. Steinhauser was a superintendent, and I went to talk to him, and he said, look, if you can convince any principal to go into a bilingual program, you do it. So I went to talk to Carlos Cardenas, I think is his name. And he said, well, if you can convince the teachers, it's up to you. But there was talk already about the law. I don't know if we had the Bilingual Education Act yet, but the teachers agreed, and I trained them.
Did you have a graduate degree by this time?
No. I was working on my master's
Where?
at the University of Texas, taking classes.
In Austin.
Yeah.
In what?
Administration. I wanted to be a principal.
But you had been a principal.
Yeah, but without the certification.
So you were in San Antonio working for the service center.
Yes.
Uh,
I was a token Mexican. Whenever the feds would come to visit us, I sat at the head table, and they'd show me off. But whenever the feds would leave, I was go back to your office and do what you could. I was never pushed to do anything or encouraged to do anything by the director. He had been my professor at the University of Texas, so he remembered me and he hired me.
who was he?
His name is or was Dwayne Estes, Dr. Dwayne Estes.
Hermano de Nolan.
Hermano de Nolan Estes, famous Nolan Estes. Yeah. But he was very political, you know. But we sponsored for the first time a Texas-wide bilingual conference, and I was on the planning committee. We had it at the Tropicana Hotel in San Antonio for the first time. There had been a conference in Arizona, Maria Urquides, in Tucson, okay? When those people left that conference, they were told, now go out and spread the word. It's in your own state, begin a bilingual conference, a bilingual movement. So we planned it very carefully. I was the representative from the center, and there were people from the school district, and it was very successful. We had Senator Ralph Yarbrough came to speak, and the Cardenas spoke. Yeah.
Did you get to know Ralph Yarbrough personally?
Oh, no. I wish I had.
How long were you at the Regional Service Center in San Antonio?
2 years. I was hired away by the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. A friend of mine had been a department head there at the center, and he went to teach at the University of New Mexico, and he became administrator there, and he hired me. He called me to go interview, and I was interviewed, and they hired me immediately and sent me to South America.
But you were hired to do what?
To go to South America,
To do what?
to go to Ecuador and train school teachers in the entire country of Ecuador and help them write textbooks. Their textbooks were terrible because people would decide on their own to write a textbook at home, and they'd publish it, they'd sell it, and those were the textbooks but it wasn't a textbook program that was supported by the state. The United States of America, Alliance for Progress, remember Alliance for Progress? Kennedy's thing? They had a lot of money, and they sent a team of teachers to Ecuador. And I lived there 2 years and trained school teachers throughout the entire country. Quito, Guayaquil, Tena, Cuenca, just everywhere.
So you went as part of a bigger team.
We were about 4 people.
You were married already.
Yes, yes. My wife went with me, and my children, and she was pregnant, and we had a child there in Ecuador, and then we had another child in Ecuador. So 2 of my 5 kids are Ecuadorians, and I call them Eki Meki Tekis. Eki Meki Tekis because they're Mexican, Texans, and Ecuadorians. And they're very proud.
How long were you in Ecuador?
2 years. 1 year I was a teacher trainer. I traveled throughout the entire country. I had a big, huge van, big, given to me by the government, with gasoline from the government, books from the government, and I'd go and I'd train school teachers in Bloom's taxonomy, in oral language, in ESL, everything.
Was the instruction done in Spanish or in English?
In Spanish. You see, Spanish, because these are local teachers who they themselves merely had a few years of education. If in Ecuador, if you had finished the 5th grade, you could then teach 4th, 3rd, 2nd, 1st. If you had finished the 8th grade, you could teach 7th, 6th, 5th. You see, so the standards were not very high. Getting a job was very difficult, but they were great people, beautiful people.
Who was paying your salary at the time? Was it the University of New Mexico
No.
or
The Alliance for Progress.
federal government?
The federal government gave money to the University of New Mexico, a ton of money, and they hired people to go to Ecuador.
So you didn't really work much in New Mexico.
Oh, yes.
You did.
When I finished my job in Ecuador, training teachers and writing textbooks, we published textbooks, reading textbooks, math and science textbooks, very modern, with beautiful lesson plans, and printed by the United States. This government printed their textbooks and distributed the textbooks throughout the entire country. When I finished there, I went back to the University of New Mexico, and bilingual education was flourishing, and they needed somebody to help. Dr. Dolores Gonzalez was there. Dolores Gonzalez had preceded me in Quito. When she left Quito, she went to the University of New Mexico and started the bilingual program. I joined her. And so I was a visiting professor, adjunct professor, something like that. And but I didn't have my PhD, so I took classes and trained school teachers. I went to Española, I went to Taos, I went to Santa Fe, and trained school teachers.
So you continued graduate work at the University of New Mexico?
And I got my PhD there.
In what?
In bilingual education, English second language, early childhood education. We had a Dr. Marie Hughes. She was world renowned as a professor there in early childhood education. She got a ton of money from the federal government just on her name. And she was going to teach 6 students at a time. That's all, just 6. I was one of the 6. So I quit teaching. I became a student, got a terrific stipend, bought a beautiful house. I had 5 kids. But so.
Is this the house you still have?
No. This was in Albuquerque. Yeah.
When did you defend your dissertation?
Okay, it had to have been 1970 or 69 in there, because in 1973 I came here. So there's some people from this university went to visit Albuquerque, and they recruited me, and I agreed because New Mexico doesn't pay very well, and my salary here was going to be much, much better. And I had a home in McAllen that I was renting out, so I already had a home.
So you brought your family to McAllen, where you would take a position at Pan American College or university?
It was university.
Okay.
Yeah, Mike Nevares was president.
Mike Nevares would have become president.
I think he was
If you came in 73, maybe he would have been vice president, because he became president in 81. Ralph Schilling.
I didn't meet him. I met Nevares.
Nevares.
He's the one that negotiated with me. And I came in as associate professor.
You skipped the assistant.
I skipped that. I said I wouldn't come unless I'm associate. And then I was made full professor.
When? How many years?
About 2 years later.
Really?
Yeah.
And so you were brought in to what? To develop the bilingual
Yes,
education program?
Exactly. Amen.
And so can you get into how that happened? Like the kinds of maybe thinkers that you would lean on to build a bilingual education program. Who were the theorists? What was the work? And did you also bring some of your own personal experience into this?
I don't remember names very well. When you get my age, there were people from throughout the university, because it was going to be a multidisciplinary bilingual program. And it had to involve linguists, English teachers, history teachers. There were people who were specialists in many fields, many fields. And we got together and we talked about the program itself. And the linguists were very, very powerful. They felt that bilingual education really was linguistics, and that's it. And if you knew linguistics, if you knew supersegmentals and allophones and phonemes, if you knew all that, you'd be a great bilingual teacher. That was their argument. So I brought I had done a lot of work in ESL, and I had trained myself to speak Spanish at a professional level, which many of us didn't have before. You see, when you're teaching professors in normal schools, now these are the guys who teach the kids to be school teachers, and you're teaching them, not the kids. you have to speak Spanish and you have to speak it well. So I was very, very careful about picking up the professional jargon, la enseñanza de la educación, la enseñanza de las materias, del contenido, so that you begin to develop in confidence and in the language itself. So that helped a lot. But also knowledge of ESL. I had majored here in Spanish and English. So I knew the grammar rules of both languages, and I could do contrastive analysis. So that background, when I was 17 years old, helped me later. And I had a great professor there at the University of New Mexico, Francisco Angel, Dr. Angel. He was an intellect, if there ever was one, and he trained me, he taught me.
Where was he from?
From New Mexico. But he knew Bloom's taxonomy, and he knew cognitive domain, affective domain. He could talk forever.
So if you could, say, ground a certain philosophy that helped you to build the program here, how would you articulate that philosophy?
We spoke of different facets. There was the intellectual facet that had to be there, and it had to be well developed, intellectual. And then there was the cultural component, and that had to be very carefully assembled. There was the affective domain. We had different facets to work on, and different people from throughout the university who would help. And then we sat down to develop the courses themselves. Now, there were guidelines from the state, obviously, so we designed courses. And I wrote most of the course description. But I don't think those are being used now.
Sorry. But at that time, what was the goal of, or what was the goal of bilingual education, or this program that you were developing with other faculty here? What was the focus of that program as you're trying to prepare teachers?
The program here or the program for kids in the public schools?
Well, for here, that would then impact what was happening in the public schools.
Yeah. We tried to have different, like I said, different themes or different emphases in the program. We wanted the language arts to be very, very important, both English and Spanish, the culture. Theories about culture were not very prevalent. They're not very strong. So I developed an outline of 20 cultural components: diet, costuming, dance, music, art, drama, architecture, ethics, and on and on and on. And around these 20 components of culture, we developed ingredients. Like there was artifacts that you have to consider for each of those. There were behaviors that were critical in the implementation of that component, and then there were beliefs, I think it was. So everything was outlined very, very carefully. But if I were going to summarize, we wanted a methodology component that would be strong, a language component, a cultural component. And around those components, we developed courses. Yeah. I wish I had.
How were the public schools at the time pushing the whole bilingual? You know, because as you're building this program, the public schools are also now being introduced to the Bilingual Education Act of 68. And then you get things like Lau v. Nichols in 74, Lau remedies thereafter. And so Ramon Villescas has to respond to some of these things.
Yes.
Other people in the schools have to respond to some of these things. So how are those things being dealt with in the public schools as best as you can recollect? And did you have a role in any of that?
I did a lot of staff development for the districts in the valley. I was the evaluator for the bilingual program in Brownsville for years and years under Mr. Barber. Mr. Barber was the director, and I was his evaluator. So I evaluated the programs, visiting the schools and observing teachers and taking notes and things. So I trained teachers in Brownsville, Harlingen, Farsawan Alamo, McAllen. I did a lot of work in McAllen. La Jolla, I've done a lot of work in La Jolla. Mission, Rio Grande City, Roma. So most of the valley, was I covered and other professors covered as a consultant. Now, one of the districts, West Lacoa, hired me away from Pan American for 1/4 time, just 1/4. So they paid 1/4 of my salary here, so I could be a staff member in West Lacoa. So I had a school I had to report to. I had a little office.
Who was the person responsible for doing that from Westlaco?
Tony Rico. Tony Rico was a superintendent, and he was my friend. He and I took classes together here at Pan American. We sat side by side, and we socialized. And he was my friend, so he hired me, and I worked with his teachers.
On bilingual education programming?
Yes. Many of the teachers could speak Spanish, the social dimension of Spanish, but not the academic. They could say, well, whenever they get in front of the kids to teach, sometimes they'd say, en este chart hay varios characters y vamos a escribir oraciones acerca de estos characters. And so that was the kind of Spanish that was spoken, and it was not bad, but it was not academic. And if you're going to teach in a bilingual program, we felt you had to be as good as a teacher in Mexico City and as good as a teacher in Massachusetts or wherever. And you had to embody and encompass those two dimensions in one teacher. But I did a lot of work in different districts.
So as you were building this department or this program here, you must have really done some heavy recruitment of faculty to be on your team.
We didn't have that many professors in the program. We had Ricardo Perez. Ricardo Perez. We had Arturo Chapa. We had Nancy Smither. We were about 4 or 5, because the program was not very large, and the faculty that was not bilingual, they didn't approve of bilingual education, and they let us know at faculty meetings. And so we were like the orphan child. We were not heavily supported.
Who was your dean during most of that time?
We had Dean Nichols, J.C. Nichols, Dean.
Was he supportive of bilingual?
No. I was called into his office once because the head of my department objected to my using Spanish in the classroom with my bilingual teachers, because this was America and you don't speak Spanish in America. And he ordered me, the head of my department, to teach my classes in English only. And the name of the course was El Proceso de la Lectura en Español. That was the name of the course. El Proceso de la Lectura en Español. And there was a few teachers that needed the number of the course for their record. And they didn't speak Spanish. And they were very offended that I was speaking Spanish in the class. So they reported me, and then he called me in, and then he took me to the dean's office so the dean would chastise me. And the dean told me, you cannot speak Spanish. You have to do it in English. Only English. And
So 30 years after.
but later on, he changed his mind, and he told me that he'd been wrong.
Really? What helped him change his mind?
But it was a few years later. I saw him somewhere, and he said, "Hey, I remember, I didn't mean it.
He didn't mean it?
I shouldn't pay attention to it. That it was not important. You know.
That was important for you.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. Because it sent me back to Roosevelt Elementary School, where I was spanked by the principal for speaking Spanish. And here was my dean.
Plain like Mrs. Thigpen.
I don't want to belittle Mrs. Thigpen. She was a great woman. She loved Mexican Americans. She did all kinds of things for Mexican Americans. But she believed, like many believe, that speaking Spanish at school is bad. Because how are you going to learn English if you only speak Spanish? So they figured spanking us was good.
How many years were you on the faculty at Pan American?
20. That I do remember. 1973 to 1993. 20 years. I loved my students, but I did not like the administration at all. We had one good team.
Cool.
You would ask me his name. Me acuerdo.
Bernal. Cunningham.
Bernal didn't like me. Bernal did not like me at all. I don't know why. We were friends in San Antonio. But no. No. You make a lot of enemies if you're in bilingual education.
Really?
At that time.
Well, what about today?
See, I'm out of it. I'm home watching television.
MSNBC.
MSNBC. 6 hours a day. Rachel Maddow, Chris Hayes.
What is it about Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes that speaks to you?
She's a brilliant woman, very articulate. She has her PhD from Oxford University. She's very, very smart.
What is your take, Dr. Gonzalez, of the evolution of bilingual education, 1968 to 2013?
I don't think it's as significant now in the state of Texas as it was during the time when the federal government was pushing bilingual education. I don't know. I don't read very much in the newspapers about bilingual education and how the government is supporting that bilingual education. I don't know. I feel it went up, and maybe it's going down a bit.
Why?
I don't know. You know, that's a good question. La política, yeah, I think, I don't know that we have the leaders that we need, statewide and national leaders. I don't think we have them. We don't have a leader at the agency that I can identify with. Maybe it's my problem. I don't think there's any national leader that is very prominent in bilingual education. pushing bilingual. They're pushing all kinds of issues, poverty, food stamps, the health laws. But I don't hear major legislators pushing bilingual education.
Who was the last one that you remember who did?
I think Rubén Hinojosa has pushed bilingual education to some degree. But Severo Gomez, Dr. Severo Gomez was the Commissioner of Education for a while, and he pushed bilingual education. I don't know. Jose Cárdenas.
About 2 weeks ago, we had the Castañeda family here. The Castañeda family of Castañeda versus Pickard. You remember that case? Raymondville, Texas. Pam Castañeda, who was a child in the 70s and whose father filed a lawsuit against Mrs. Pickard, who was the president of the school board in Raymondville, was here. She sat right there. Pam's mother sat right next to her, Flora Castañeda, who's about 84. We also brought the lawyer from the Texas Rural Legal Aid, a fellow named David Hall, and Pam's ex-husband, Victor Rubalcaba, who has been a school board member in Raymondville. And David Hall gave a sweeping historical analysis of why Castañeda, 1981, by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans, the Castañeda court that laid out the rules for how to follow bilingual ed. David Hall spoke of why Castañeda has not been that significant. He said, very much like your commentary, that there was a time in the 70s when the federal government supported bilingual, and the Office for Civil Rights enforced malfeasance with bilingual. And there were other regulatory entities enforcing bilingual. When the Castañeda case was ruled in 1981, was the time that Ronald Reagan was getting into office. And Ronald Reagan and his administration systematically dismantled that entire regulatory enforcement apparatus.
It's very interesting. Yeah.
And so the 80s and 90s, and even No Child Left Behind, that effectively kills bilingual. Now it's all about learning English.
Yeah.
And for a while there was some traction around learning English by understanding and developing your native tongue. Can you speak to David Hall's analysis a little bit?
Well, I agree with everything you said. There's all these political movements. There's the Tea Party, who would absolutely be against bilingual education, probably. I've had people in the audience where I've spoken stand up and say, I was young then, so she said, "Young man, you are threatening the very fabric of American society." I'll never forget that. You are threatening the very fabric of American society with bilingual education. They feel that if you can do it in English. We used to have a governor here, Ma Ferguson.
Esposa de Pa Ferguson.
It's supposed to Pa Ferguson who was kicked out, and then she took over. Well, she was talking about Mexican Americans, and she said to the newspapers, if Jesus Christ himself, when he walked this earth, spoke only English, why can't these Mexicans appreciate that? That was our governor.
Our governor knew that Jesus Christ actually spoke English.
He spoke English, had blue eyes, he had blonde hair.
For the record, what language did Jesus Christ speak?
Aramaic.
Some, but not English.
English. You know, if that's what our politicians have believed, you know, So it's a beautiful concept because if Spanish is your language, your emotional language, and possibly your intellectual language, and you express yourself in this language with your parents and your brothers and your sisters, but you have to learn how to read in this other language. And reading is so crucial in the mind of teachers. Teachers think reading is it. Oral language, no. Speaking the language, no. It's reading the language. So they want to teach reading, but reading in English. But if you can't speak that language, you have no idea what that language is about. You know, you enter into the world of Dick and Jane, as I did, and you think of Spot, and you think of Puff, and you see them operating, and they go visit their grandmother, and they're playing with the animals at the farm, and everything is rosy, and there are no problems. You know, it's a wonderland. It's a never land, and we were made to learn how to read in that language. Fortunately, I decoded the language and I could do it, and I worked on vocabulary. But my brothers didn't. We're five. Only one finished high school and went on to college besides me. That's it. Most of my cousins, most everybody dropped out of school after having gone to Sam Houston. And then they didn't show up at the high school. And because they never showed up at the high school, nobody was going to go look for them to find out why weren't they in high school. So the biggest dropout rate was right there. And if you look at our yearbook, our annual, and look at the brown faces in our senior class in 1951, precious few. But we were hundreds and hundreds when we were in first grade. But the schools were not a welcoming agency.
As you reflect, Dr. Gonzalez, on the last number of years, let's say the last 50 years, and you reflect on that knowing that the population group that has the most challenges in school today is the population group that is known as English language learners.
Yes.
As you reflect on the last 40 plus years, do you believe that bilingual education is the approach to respond to the academic needs, challenges, maybe opportunities of English language learners?
Absolutely. If they're English language learners and they're at some stage in English, they shouldn't be bombarded with a reading program in a language that is so deficient or weak or not strong. You know? But if their language is Spanish and you speak the language and you need to decode and you need to understand, and there's all those comprehension skills, you know, that people don't talk about. There's identify facts and details, fact and opinion, sequence, cause and effect, main idea, predicting outcomes, drawing conclusions, making generalizations. There's all these very high level comprehension objectives. And how are you going to master that objective in a language that you do not speak? If you're reading a story and they ask you, what is the moral of the story? What is the story trying to say? What can you learn from the story? And you're supposed to give some kind of abstract generalization, but you don't really speak the language. You have those 17 words that I talk about. You might be able to do it if it were done in Spanish and be able to answer, but you can't in this other language that you do not speak. So I don't think it's fair to ask a kid to judge, to make generalizations, to draw conclusions, to find the main idea of a story, if that's not a strong language.
So you said absolutely that bilingual education is
some form.
in some form.
Yeah.
Yeah, because all children are
Modified
different.
for the needs of that population.
So if we believe that that is, then if you could give us one or two ideas about one or two strategies to use to help people understand that that is the best way to do it. If you could give us that kind of insight based on your wisdom, based on your experience, how can we make that happen?
I think if you were to point out in a very efficient and dramatic way what is entailed in comprehension, how there's low-level comprehension and there's comprehension at the highest level, understood by the very brilliant people, and that there's these levels, and these levels involve strategies that have to do with differentiating between fact and opinion, establishing a chronological sequence, predicting an outcome. And if they were subjected to doing it in a language that they do not speak, they'd understand how difficult it is to think in that language and be able to analyze in that language. Many of us Hispanics barely operate in the language, in a high school, for instance. Barely have enough vocabulary to explain basic things because we have not been trained. And then to be asked to do these mental gymnastics, I think would be interesting. Also, the whole gamut of vocabulary. I have a taxonomy of vocabulary that I've developed, and there's basic vocabulary like go, stop, see, yes, no, never, when, but, all the way up to technical vocabulary, all the way up to abstract vocabulary, where we deal with words like mendacity, alacrity, alluvial, words like egregious, mendacity. Being able to juggle words and be clear with accurate vocabulary would be one way to explain to people, look, how would you do in vocabulary if you were thrown into this? Gonzalez.
Well, you also spoke about maybe 15 minutes ago about the absence of really good, bold, effective leadership.
Yes.
You know, when you did mention that there was a Pepe Cárdenas at some point. And so that actually brings a lot of things to mind, you know, about the relative absence of those kinds of public voices who would make a convincing and maybe even dramatic argument for the necessity of investing and committing to something like this. So, Dr. Gonzalez, as the law in 2001, 2002 that's called No Child Left Behind, that is the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 65, as NCOB was reauthorized, and as it got rid of every single word that was bilingual. All bilingual is out. Now it's about learning English. As that has happened, there is also a process that has gained a little bit of traction in bilingual education, that is dual language instruction. Your views on that?
I've never really quite understood the difference. I need to have somebody sit down with me and explain how they view dual language. Whatever I hear about it, I think bilingual. I mean, in my head, there's bilingual education. But dual language obviously means two languages. Is there a difference in methodology? I don't know. So you see, I wouldn't be able to answer your question because I really don't understand what they mean by dual language.
I see.
Everything I've heard, I relate back to bilingual education.
So I'm going to ask Joy to do a 60-second synopsis of what dual language means, because I really want to get your reflection on this. I mean, you being somebody who dealt with these kind of issues, we're going back here because you've been dealing with this since the 1940s and 50s, really, as a professional since the 1960s. So I want to get your take on this, on how you feel about dual. So Joy, if you could just give Dr. Gonzalez a nutshell version of what it is.
Okay, I'm going to use, I guess, a metaphor. I spoke to a principal recently with something similar, and I had very limited time. In bilingual ed, I feel like I'm speaking to more of an expert in trying to explain something to this, but it's an umbrella, right? So under bilingual education, we have many different programs, ESL being one of them, ESL pull-out, ESL content. We have transitional bilingual ed, which is early exit, late exit. And then we have dual language, which is more of a maintenance program, which is what it kind of boils down to. ESL, I'm sure it's a pull-out, maintenance pull-out, just English instruction, English language, English vocabulary, many times focused on different content. We have the transitional model program where schools use Spanish as a treatment to help the child develop English. Once they have a certain level of proficiency, usually is very limited, then they go to all English classroom, usually around second, third grade, third being the late, second being first, second being more or less the early exit. And then we have dual language where there is no official transitional stage. The children are constantly develop language proficiency in both English and Spanish. They start off with maybe more of the literacy in their native while developing the second language, and then they go all the way through, ideally, like in one of our districts in the Valley, all the way through high school where they're still receiving content in English and Spanish. That's the main difference. Like I explained to a principal, it's like when you're taking medication, it would be like the transitional. You're kind of taking a treatment to then get better, versus a dual language, I see it more as a lifestyle, where you will just stop eating junk food, and that's just your lifestyle, more of a healthy lifestyle. And so in the end product of a transitional, even ESL program, is English proficiency. And we don't care about the Spanish. We don't measure Spanish. That's not a goal, very similar to our government goals of No Child Left Behind. How is the English? And a dual language program, the goal is proficiency in both. So we are still measuring the Spanish. We're still monitoring the Spanish development as well as the English. And literature shows how both will be maximized, and they are proficient at grade level. Great level, that biliteracy grade level, and content biliteracy Spanish, and not only language arts, but science, social studies, and math. And so they're able to function in those content areas in either English or Spanish. And that's the ultimate goal of dual language. And that's the main difference, whereas a typical, what they would call bilingual program, under that umbrella would be more the goal of being, they function in those content areas at grade level in English. And we just use Spanish, again, as a treatment to get them there, in a nutshell.
Dual language is more global.
Yes.
You see, I never saw bilingual education as something that was limited and restricted, and that the goal was to go into English as soon as possible. Mm-hmm. There's been, like McAllen used to, a long time ago, the superintendent said by October the 10th of the first grade, they have to transition to English. Regardless, every child in the district has to transition to English by October the 10th in the first grade, because the objective was English. Mm-hmm. I didn't see that in bilingual education. I figured it'd be working in the two languages, which is what I hope for my grandchildren. Yeah, and I'm pushing that, and I've been able to get that with half of my grandchildren.
And that's something I wanted to ask you, Dr. Gonzalez, and with your personal experience, with your childhood, with your experiences at Roosevelt, Sam Houston, and all the way through, even up to at the university, how different do you want it for the child now, for your grandchildren, for the children that are entering pre-KK, kindergarten right now? How different do you want it for them? Now, in a leader, because I so see you as a leader in bilingual education, how would you want to impact those schools and advise them, not only academic, because I think you mentioned a lot of social, cultural impacting academic, but the whole child. How do we make things better?
I think we have to look at what's happening in Europe, In Europe, kids learn 3 and 4 and 5 languages, and it's normal, it's natural, it's expected. They graduate speaking several languages. Here we only value English, and that's our whole value. And I think we'd have to work with our politicians and our educators to convince the country that this country needs to be bilingual, trilingual, quadrilingual, that there's a lot of merit in speaking several languages. But when you establish the value, you begin to change opinions. Only then will we have great bilingual or dual language programs. Right now, I have 4 kids. 2 of them are very, very interested in maintaining their Spanish. They didn't want to speak Spanish when they were young kids. But then when they went to university, they realized the value of speaking 2 or 3 or 4 different languages. And my son was accepted at Harvard Law School. But he asked him, could he take a year off to go to Chile and perfect his Spanish? And he went to the University of Valparaiso and studied Spanish, studied all the courses at the university in Spanish for 1 year to perfect his Spanish. And he came back to Harvard, became a lawyer, and he's a lawyer in Houston. And he uses his Spanish to travel to Mexico and Latin America and conduct business and give speeches and write papers in Spanish. And he feels this duality that is part of dual language. But to raise children like that is not easy. You have to love the language. When I was a child, I went to the Mexican theater on 17th Street, El Azteca, and I saw the Mexican movies. Dolores del Rio, Leticia Palma, Arturo de Cordova. I saw them all, and I enjoyed the culture and the language. And then I'd go to Main Street, McAllen, to the Palace Theater, and I'd see Ginger Rogers and Red Skelton and Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, and I'd enjoy them. And I learned this culture and this other culture in separate theaters. And I would laugh with the comedians in English and laugh with the comedians in Spanish. And it's there's beauty there. But how do you develop it in children? I think you have to have parents who are very ambitious for the kids, ambitious for the knowledge of languages. I wish my kids could study Chinese, because I think that's the language that's coming. But it's a very political issue. Right now, if you were to speak about it in Texas, the Tea Party would put you down.
Gonzalez, if you could speak to us a little bit about your wife.
Teresa.
Where's she from?
Ed Couch.
Tell us a little bit about
Most
her.
of my friends and I went to Ed Couch to marry, because all the beautiful women were in Ed Couch. I married Teresa. This friend of mine had a girlfriend there, so he dragged me to go visit his girlfriend. But meanwhile, there was a church bazaar, so I went to the church bazaar, Santa Teresita Church, and I walked around, and there was a cake stand where they were selling slices of cake, and I love cake, so I walked over there, and she was selling cake. And I bought some cake from her, and I asked her if she could walk with me. So we walked around the bazaar. And then they came with this hoop. They trapped us with a hoop because they were going to marry us. And they took us to the judge. And for 15 cents, I got married. And I said, I do, and she said, I do. So she's a school teacher, retired. She put in 30.
Hang on, that story there, that was not the real wedding. Or that was a real wedding? That's just something that happened
Yeah.
because you didn't know each other.
No, not at all.
But
And I didn't know if she was going to say I do, and she didn't know if I was going to say I do. But
how old were you when that happened?
I was 21.
But it was
There's
almost,
a game that you have to pay 15 cents.
but it was prophetic
it was prophetic.
because you would wind up marrying her how many years later?
4. But on the second date, I'd already told her, you and I are going to get married. Yeah. So she came to Pan American at night and got her BA at night, driving from Ed Couch.
What is her maiden name?
Yarritu. Yarritu. It's Basque. It's not Spanish. It's in Spain, but it's the Vascongadas. The Basques don't speak Spanish. They have names like Ulibarri, Yarritu, Irrutia, all those strange sounding names. They're not Spanish.
From Ed Couch.
From Ed Couch. Yeah.
How about that?
So we married. Went to work in West Texas. We wanted to get away from the family. Went to Andrews, Texas. By Odessa in Midland is Andrews, and it has tons of oil wells. Everybody has an oil well in their backyard. There's oil everywhere, and so they had a ton of money, and they built palaces for schools. Palaces, and it was the highest paying school district in the state of Texas.
When was that?
1959, when we married, we went off directly to Andrews to teach. And she was teaching at one school, and I was teaching at a school.
So this is after Hidalgo.
Yes.
I was trying to figure out
Yes, after that.
what couple of years you slipped that in.
Okay, because after McAllen, after Hidalgo, when we got married in 1959, I was offered a job in Andrews teaching Spanish to gringuitos. And it was a community that was totally devoted to teaching their kids 2 languages. They had all the money in the world. They had the best schools, school buildings. They had the highest salaries in the state of Texas, and they wanted their kids to speak both English and Spanish, and mostly Anglos. Very, very few Mexicanos. And so I taught one school, and she taught the other school, and we taught them orally. And no reading. I was given orders by school district, by school board. No reading and writing, nada. They are not to know that you can speak English. They should never hear you speak English. They need to be verbal in Spanish. So we taught them. We taught them how to sing. We taught them how to act. They put on little plays. We did all kinds of. We used all kinds of gestures, and they could speak Spanish. Los gringuitos.
In that circumstance, children were not punished for speaking English, were they?
No, they were all very. It was a community that had a lot of money, so, and these were very well-off people who wanted their kids to speak Spanish.
In 1959-60.
Yeah, and they hired a Spanish teacher for each of the elementary schools, and they wanted the Spanish to grow. And I'd go into a classroom and I'd tell them how to say, "Pase usted." And I wouldn't go in until they say "Pase usted." And I'd knock on the door and knock on the door and knock on the door. They say "Pase usted." And I walk in and I say, muchas gracias. And then a child saw me on the playground and yelled, "Hi, Mr. Pase usted." Then I realized that they really hadn't understood. But they were not to hear any English. It was wonderful. It was a great year.
One more question, Dr. Gonzalez. Who is your hero?
Hero in acting, hero in politics, hero in education, hero.
your life, who is the hero who has most inspired you, moved you?
That's a tough question. I'm going to say my professor at the University of New Mexico, Francisco Angel. His name was Francisco Angel, but he called himself Dr. Angel. And he was an intellectual. He was a great man. Great man. He led me very carefully through all kinds of intellectual mazes.
Did you keep up with him for years?
Yes. He was at the university, and I came back to the university, and he came to Quito, Ecuador, to lecture, and I was with him there. And I toured him throughout the entire city, where all the goodbyes were. I don't know. If you're going to take political heroes, I can tell you Kennedy, Clinton. Now Mrs. Clinton. But in education, I think it would be Francisco Angel.
And how about in your personal life?
My dear friend Gas Guerra, who just passed away a couple of years ago. He was a man that was a great educator, knew how to manage a school district, had all the knowledge of playing politics and developing interrelationships with people and hiring the right people, surrounding himself with the best people. But he was also very gifted in watching movies and reciting poetry. We would recite poetry to each other in English and in Spanish.
Unless you have a question for us.
I'm all right.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez.